They said the fire ended in the year of our Lord 1847, yet the air of Savannah still trembled, as though the flames had never truly gone out. The house stood blackened and skeletal, its brick ribs jutting against the southern sky, and though rain had poured and winds had swept the ashes into the earth, the scent clung stubbornly, not of timber nor of flesh, but of something more terrible. Retribution, the elders whispered, and when they spoke the word, they lowered their eyes to the soil, as though even the ground listened. Children were warned not to linger near the charred foundation that still cut its shadow across the earth. The iron gate remained standing, warped but unbroken, and there the smoke was thickest, a haze that never seemed to lift even on the brightest morning. Mothers drew their little ones away with harsh tugs of the wrist, muttering that the devil himself stood guard by those bars, holding the stench in his grasp. And yet there were those who came at night, men who drank too deep from their cups, women with grief etched into their faces. They came to the gate to breathe in the phantom smoke, to test if their courage could withstand the bitterness that scratched at the lungs. Every one of them staggered back with tears burning their eyes and the taste of ash on their tongues, as if the fire had chosen to crawl into their throats and remind them of what it had devoured. One ragged boy swore he heard the crackle of burning wood, though the ruins lay silent. Another whispered that he saw a pale hand resting on the gate, not gripping, not beckoning, merely resting as though waiting for someone brave enough to step closer. The constable silenced such talk with a firm hand on his belt, yet even he, when pressed, admitted he avoided the road at dusk. Not wood, not flesh, the oldest women hissed when the young pressed them for truth. What then? The children begged, but the old women only shuddered, clutching their shawls tight, for they remembered Martha, and they knew the smell was hers, not her body but her defiance, the smoke of a girl who would not kneel even in death. The gate itself bore scars no hammer could mend, its iron twisted in the center, not outward as fire would melt it, but inward, as though something had pulled from the other side. Travelers who passed through town often stopped to stare, crossing themselves when they felt the draught that crept from those blackened bars, a wind that was not cold but warm, like the breath of a furnace exhaling upon the living. There were murmurs that the master's voice could still be heard in the crackle of the phantom fire. Not cries for mercy, but a roar of rage. A man denied his authority, a man burned by the very hands he believed to own. Those who lingered longest claimed they heard another sound beneath his, the low hum of a woman's voice, steady, unshaken, weaving through the fire as if guiding it. And so the townsfolk said the blaze was not an accident, nor mere revenge, but a binding, a curse sealed in smoke. By morning, the streets near the gate often lay streaked with soot, though no chimney smoked nearby. Black handprints smeared across doors, fences, even the white stones of the churchyard. Children's tricks, the preacher declared, but the marks were too high, too wide, and they smelled of wet ash when touched. One evening, long after the fire, a carriage rolled too near the ruins. The horse reared and screamed, foam spilling from its mouth, its hooves thrashing against cobblestone. The driver swore he saw a figure step out from the smoke at the gate. Not a man, not a shadow, but the silhouette of a girl with shoulders straight, her head tilted as though listening. He dropped the reins and fled on foot. Never to drive past that road again, the townsfolk grew used to avoiding the place. They walked longer paths, added hours to their journeys. Better to sweat beneath the Georgia sun than pass the iron gate and catch the scent that burned in the lungs and sat heavy in the chest. For they all knew what it meant, even if none dared speak it aloud. The fire had not finished. It had only rested, coiling itself in silence, waiting for the night when wood, flesh, and retribution would all burn together once more. And so the chapter ends at the gate, where a boy, too curious for his own salvation, dares to press his hand against the blackened iron. The ash leaps to his skin like sparks in tinder, and when he yanks his hand away, his palm carries the imprint of a woman's face, not in scar, not in blood but in soot, a face that watches him long after he flees into the night. And in the ruins something stirs. They said Martha's eyes carried no light, only a silence that mocked chains. She was not the strongest in the field, nor the fastest with her hands, but when overseers barked and whips cracked, she stood with her head tilted just so, a posture too still, too steady, too unbroken for one who wore iron at the ankles. The masters mistook it for obedience. Yet the others knew it was not submission but defiance, pressed flat and coiled tight, like embers hidden in ash at dusk. When the fields emptied and the bodies bent low with exhaustion, Martha's gaze did not sink. She stared past the tree line, past the swollen horizon, as though listening for something older than the land itself. The women whispered that she heard voices there, not the voices of the living, but the murmurs of soil and shadow, and though the men spat and shook their heads, even they dared not walk too near her after the sun bled down. "She don't talk to us no more," one muttered. Huddled by the cabin fire. "She don't need to," said another, voice lowered to a thread. The shadows talk for her. The hush that followed was thicker than the smoke above the coals, for each had heard the rustle by their doors at night, as if dry leaves were dragged across the threshold by unseen hands. Martha's silence grew heavier with each passing day. She answered commands with the smallest nod, never with a word, never with a plea, and when the whip traced fire across her shoulders, she did not scream. Her lips only parted as though about to sing, yet no sound came. The master grew unsettled by that silence, for cruelty lives upon the cries of the beaten, and when no cries rise, the whip turns upon itself. One night, drunk with fury, he spat, "You will kneel to me." But she only looked at him, eyes void, and though her knees bent under blows, her gaze never dropped. The others saw this. They saw a girl unbroken while the rest had been worn thin, and though they feared her, they began to whisper her name, as if it were both curse and prayer. "Martha, the one who does not kneel. Martha, the one the chains cannot hold." But whispers spread wider than lips. The master's wife spoke of unease, that the girl's shadow moved strangely, longer than her body, trailing even when the sun fell behind. The children of the house swore they saw her lips moving when she sat alone, as though speaking with someone who sat beside her. Unseen once, a boy crept close enough to hear. He ran screaming to his mother, for he swore she spoke in a tongue older than speech, a sound like coals cracking in the hearth. The fields themselves began to carry her presence. Crows gathered on the fence posts when she walked, silent, watching with eyes like pits. The dogs that patrolled the grounds would not pass near her cabin, whining and pressing low to the dirt. Even the trees leaned strangely toward her path, their limbs creaking like bent backs in the dark. "She has given her voice to something else," whispered an elder one night. "Something that hates the master more than we ever could," and the others shivered. For though hatred was common, the way Martha bore it was not human. It was patient, relentless. Like a tide waiting to rise in the black hours, the cabin walls trembled. The others woke to hear her breathing, slow and steady, though her mouth was closed. Shadows thickened in corners where no light could reach. Some swore they saw fingers curl out from the dark, resting lightly on her shoulders as if in comfort. "Tell me," hissed a trembling girl beside her, "what do you see when you stare so long into the trees?" Martha did not turn, her voice finally spilling like smoke for the first time in weeks. "I see the fire waiting," she said, then silence deeper than before. The others did not ask again. But each night her presence grew stronger, as though the shadows themselves had chosen her as vessel, and those who once feared her began to sense something worse, that she no longer feared herself. By dawn her eyes glimmered not with light, but with the stillness of coals banked for the night, and when she looked upon the house of her master, its tall windows gleaming in the first sun, it seemed for a breath of time that smoke curled within her gaze. Not the smoke of a dream, but the smoke of an ending not yet begun. The children of the fields learned to avoid her path, but one too bold lingered near as she left the well. "What do you wait for?" the child dared ask. Martha's lips curved, not in kindness, not in cruelty, but in something colder. "For the chains to break," she whispered, and as she passed, the child felt a shiver, as though the ground itself had split beneath her steps. That night the others woke to the sound of humming, a sound that was not her own, yet came from her lips, low, steady, ancient. The shadows at the cabin door stretched taller than the roof, and those who dared look swore they saw flames flicker across her skin without burning. When dawn came, her silence returned, but in her eyes there was no longer defiance. There was promise, and at the gate of the great house, the smoke rose once more, faint, bitter, and waiting. The house did not stand as other houses did. It leaned inward upon itself as though ashamed, as though sickened by what it had held. The shutters creaked and groaned with every shift of wind, not like timber giving way, but like teeth grinding against one another in restless sleep. The neighbors swore the noise was a warning, the house straining to speak of what it had seen, but trapped in the wood like a secret too foul to confess. By daylight, the mansion appeared only ruined, its paint blistered, its glass long gone. Yet still the shutters clung tight, nailed and swollen, refusing to swing free. No hand, not even those of scavengers, dared pry them open, for it was said that whatever had pressed its face to that glass on the night of the fire still lingered within. Watching from behind those sealed lids, children dared one another to run across the yard and touch the wall. Few returned without pale lips and trembling knees. Those who lingered longest swore the wood itself breathed. They laid their palms against the siding and felt a slow rise and fall, as if the house were not a ruin at all but a chest, pulling in air it did not need. Inside, doors had never behaved as doors should. They did not open, they did not close, they swallowed. When a latch clicked, the sound was not sharp but wet, as though the hinges drank from the movement. Slaves once told of vanishing in those halls, passing from one room to the next, and finding themselves not where they ought to be, but deeper, always deeper, the path lengthening with each step. Some returned hours later, pale and dazed, swearing they had only crossed a threshold. Others were never seen again, their names carried away like smoke. "Martha walks in rooms we cannot follow," an old woman once whispered before her tongue went still forever. Because she is not swallowed, she swallows back. The master had forbidden talk of it, but he himself was not untouched. There were nights he woke drenched in sweat, his sheets damp as though he had been pulled from a drowning. He claimed the doors moved in the dark, shifting from one side of the room to another. Once, when drink loosed his tongue, he confessed he feared the very walls. "They lean closer," he muttered, eyes bloodshot. "They lean closer each night. No servant would climb the stairs after dusk." The second floor was worse than the first. There the shutters pressed outward, as if straining to hold something in. The hall smelled of scorched pine and something sweeter, cloying like burnt sugar left too long upon the stove. And in the corners, the plaster bulged like skin blistering with heat. The house did not forget the night Martha set her fire. The others said the flames had not destroyed it, but baptized it, that the fire had entered the walls as a spirit enters the body. And now it lived, waiting, hungering, listening. "Do you hear it?" whispered a boy who once stood too near. His eyes went wide as the shutters quivered without wind. "It's not wood. Shells not iron," he said. "It's teeth." Chewing slow, the townsfolk avoided the road that bent near the gates. But the house remained in their sight, looming always at the edge of thought. A relic, a warning, a wound that never healed. Some claimed they dreamed of it even from miles away. Dreams where the shutters split wide and a face pressed against the glass. Not Martha's, not the master's, but something between them. A face drawn in soot, with eyes that burned too bright. And so the house stood, not silent but groaning, not empty but swollen, its doors waiting, its windows sealed, its halls stretching longer with every retelling, and those who walked past quickened their pace, knowing that if they slowed, they might feel the faint pull at their backs, as if the doors were reaching, as if the house wished to swallow them too. By the time dusk sank and the shutters stilled, only one figure lingered at the gate, a child braver than sense, clutching a broken lantern. She whispered Martha's name through the iron. And in the darkened house a door clicked, not open, not closed, but deeper, always deeper, and something began to walk toward the sound of her voice. The master woke most nights with sweat upon his brow, not from heat nor fever, but from sound, a humming, low and steady, winding through the boards like water beneath stone. It was not loud, not insistent, it was worse. It was soft, patient, the way a cradle rocks though no hand touches it, the way a grave settles though no shovel digs. He knew the voice. It belonged to the girl who would not kneel. Martha, her lips had been silent for weeks, yet her song unfurled each night, as though poured into his chamber by an unseen hand. He would sit up in bed, candle sputtering weak against the dark, his ears straining, his heart lurching, and still the tune threaded on, drawn out and unbroken. It was a sound that mocked him, for it carried neither fear nor plea, only a steady rhythm, as if the night itself leaned in to listen. He called for her once, his voice cracking the silence. "Martha," he rasped, "if it's you, show yourself. But no answer came, only the song winding upward, curling into the rafters above his head. He held the candle high, its glow trembling against the beams, and though he saw nothing, the flame bent sideways, as if drawn toward some breath he could not see. The pale smoke appeared first as a blur, a faint twisting above the ceiling beams. Shifting where no fire burned, it gathered slow, coiling and uncoiling. He told himself it was his mind, that the lamp's smoke had wandered upward, but the smoke did not disperse, it clung, winding like fingers across the wood, and within it, a shape pressed, the barest curve of a face, eyeless, mouthless, but present. The master staggered back, choking, but when he coughed, the song only grew clearer, as though the smoke itself carried it, and for the first time, he realized the humming did not echo through the air. It came from within the rafters, from the beams themselves, as though the house had learned her voice. By dawn the sound ceased, but he could not bear the silence either. His ears strained for it, desperate. For when the humming vanished, the house felt too empty. And emptiness is often worse than haunting. The others spoke of it in whispers. "The master hears her song," one said. "Then let him hear," replied another, bitterness hot on his tongue, but even they grew uneasy. For some swore they too had heard the tune, not at midnight but in broad day. While bending to cut cane or pulling water from the well, the melody slipped into their bones, filling their chests with a weight they could not shake, and when they hummed it back, their lips tasted of ash. The master forbade her name from being spoken, yet his eyes searched for her always, and when he saw her in the yard, her face still, her lips sealed, he felt madness stir, for he knew the song was hers, though she never sang, and he wondered if she had given her voice away, pressing it into the walls, into the rafters, into the breath of the house itself, so that he might never know rest. One night, he dreamed of smoke curling down from the ceiling beams. It wound about his wrists, his throat, and he woke to find bruises blooming where no hand had touched. He tried to pray, but the words faltered, for the hymn he raised twisted into her humming, and he bit his tongue to silence it, tasting blood. "Martha," he spat into the darkness, his voice raw, "what bargain have you made?" The shadows did not answer, but the rafters groaned above him, slow and heavy, and in that groan was something too deliberate to be timber. It sounded like laughter pressed through smoke. By the third night, he ceased lighting the candle, for the light only showed him what he did not wish to see: the outlines in smoke, the shifting beams, the impression of a hand dragging itself along the ceiling. Better to sit in darkness, better to let the song roll through him like poison, than to see the face it carried. Yet one evening, unable to bear it, he fled his chamber. He stumbled down the stair, the house moaning with each step. And there in the great hall the rafters bent low, smoke curling from their edges like breath from cracked lips. The song swelled louder, no longer a hum but a chant, slow and steady, and the house itself seemed to breathe. Boards expanding, walls tightening, as though the structure had lungs. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but the sound pressed deeper, not upon his hearing but upon his very bones, and in the smoke above the face grew clearer, still eyeless, still mouthless, yet marked by defiance. Not a haunting, but a waiting, the master screamed. But the rafters answered with their groan, and as he raised his eyes, he saw the smoke dripping downward in pale strands, not falling, reaching, stretching toward him like fingers seeking to touch, and as he staggered back against the door, choking, the smoke brushed his lips, and though he clenched his teeth, the song forced itself through him, a hum not his own but hers, spilling out into the night, and when it ended, silence fell again. But above him the beams shifted once more, and he swore he saw something crawl along them, curling deeper into the wood, waiting. The night began with silence so deep it seemed carved from stone, silence so heavy it pressed against the windows of the great house, making the glass hum like a throat that dared not speak. Martha stood in the corridor. Her bare feet pressed against the warped boards that groaned beneath her weight. Though she moved with the care of a shadow, she carried nothing in her hands yet. The house felt as though it braced itself against her presence, as if it knew what would come. The latch to the master's chamber gleamed faintly in the candlelight, a strip of iron slick with years of use, polished not by kindness but by command. It had opened for him 1,000 times, and now Martha placed her hand upon it, her palm steady, her breath shallow. her eyes hollow as stone wells. The others had whispered of charms, of nails driven not into wood but into silence, into the marrow of intention. And it was said that a hand that meant freedom could make iron forget its duty. No key could break it. No force could lift it. And Martha pressed her thumb into the seam of the latch, driving it shut as if she were hammering with nothing but her will. The iron groaned, a sound that was not metal, not craft, but pain, and the bolt sank into place with a scream that seemed too human, too alive. And in that instant the door became more than wood. It became a barrier sealed by something older than locks inside. The master stirred in his sleep, his breathing thick with the wine of evening, his dreams filled with the easy cruelty of men who believe morning will always come. Yet as his fingers twitched on the coverlet, the sound reached him, a strained moan in the iron, a cry he had never heard before from his own house. He opened his eyes into darkness, thick, airless, and smelled something faint, something bitter and sweet all at once, like sap burning. "Like cloth smouldering where no flame could be seen, Martha," he whispered, though the walls did not answer, and the rafters only groaned as if choking back laughter. She had not moved, still standing in the corridor, her head tilted, her eyes raised to the beams that ran above the door, beams now veiled in smoke as pale as cobwebs, curling downward like fingers searching for breath. She hummed low, steady, her voice the same tone she had carried at midnight, the sound that had once unsettled him, now sinking like nails into his ears inside. He rose and pulled at the latch, but the iron held, groaning again in protest, like a throat trying to vomit out a nail driven too deep. His knuckles rapped the wood, hard, furious, demanding, "Open this door!" But the house swallowed his voice, walls refusing to echo what they no longer obeyed. Martha stepped back into shadow, her humming ceasing, replaced by the hiss of something unseen, and the air grew hotter, thicker, heavy with the scent of pitch and ash. She could hear him striking the door now, each blow dull, muffled, like fists against a coffin lid. "Girl, I command you." His voice cracked, swallowed mid-sentence as the smoke thickened, spilling down the corridor like water poured from above, seeping beneath the locked door, wrapping him in the breath of something he had once thought too weak to stand, too voiceless to speak, now filling every corner of the chamber with its wordless testimony. He stumbled back inside, coughing, clawing at the air, reaching for the shutters that would not yield, shutters that groaned as though mocking his hands, hinges that whispered refusal, wood that swallowed his strength like wet clay swallowing a stone. Outside the door, Martha pressed her back to the wall, eyes closed, as though listening for something only she could hear. Her lips moved, but no words escaped, only the faint shape of a prayer or a curse that rode the smoke itself into the room. The bolt shrieked again, a metallic scream like sinew tearing, and then fell silent, sealed forever by the nail that was not seen but felt in the marrow of the door. And the house trembled, beams shaking dust loose from the rafters, sparks crawling down the walls like insects born of flame. The master's voice rose once more, raw, choking, not command now but plea, the sound of a man meeting the silence he had carved into others, begging the very air to spare him. But the air had chosen its mistress, and Martha stood unmoving, watching the glow spread beneath the crack of the door. At last, a crash, the sound of flesh against wood, the final weight of desperation, but the latch did not yield. The house did not open. The smoke surged thick and triumphant, and Martha's eyes caught the reflection of fire crawling up the walls, racing toward the ceiling beams where whispers had long gathered, and as the door pulsed red with heat, as if alive, as if breathing, a shape seared itself into the iron. No letter, no word, only a mark like a nail driven downward into earth, a symbol that would never cool. Even after the ashes fell silent, the house shuddered once more, rafters bending, beams cracking, and then all was swallowed in the roar of flame, a roar that sounded eerily like laughter. And outside, beneath the night sky, Martha turned from the door and stepped into the yard, the glow painting her face not with firelight, but with the pallor of retribution. And those who watched from the slave quarters would swear until death that she carried no torch, no ember, only the silence of a girl who would not kneel. But as the roof gave way and the night tore open with sparks, something darker rode the smoke upward, curling into the stars like a shadow freed. And it was said that the nail in the latch did not melt, did not break, but remained blackened and hot, sealing more than a door. It sealed the curse of the house forever. It began not as fire should, with crackle and collapse, but with a steady roar that seemed to hold its breath, A roar like a choir locked inside stone, singing without pause, singing without end. The house was already ash in places, beams falling in jagged arcs, shingles curling like tongues. Yet the flames did not fade, did not starve. They grew brighter, hungrier, clinging to what should no longer have been there, as if burning not wood but memory itself. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the yard, their faces lit in shades of terror and awe, for the blaze gave off no sparks that fled into the night, no embers that scattered to grass or tree. It stayed fixed to the house alone, as though it despised the thought of leaving its host. Bound to the walls like a curse married to bone. "They should be gone by now," muttered one man, wringing his hat between his hands. "Fire don't last like this." But his voice broke at the end, for he saw what the others saw, heat without heat, flame without smoke rising where it should, and yet smoke did rise, pale, silken, curling upward in strange ribbons that did not scatter in the wind, but bent against it, like something guided, like whispers crawling skyward. Neighbors swore they could hear faint words in that smoke, syllables older than their ears, prayers or curses, each thread of vapor a tongue unrolling from the quarters. The slaves watched with eyes that did not blink, for they knew what the others could not name. They had seen Martha's hand press that latch. They had heard the bolt scream. They had smelled the first bitter promise of flame before the neighbors stirred in their beds. And they whispered now not of fire but of reckoning. One woman clutched her child's head to her breast and hissed into his ear, "Do not look, do not breathe it, for the blaze remembers who watches." But the boy peeked all the same, and later he would say he saw faces in the fire, pale and strained, mouths open as though still pleading for doors to open, inside the ruin. Timbers fell but were not consumed. Floorboards buckled but did not vanish, each collapse feeding the blaze without lessening its body, as if the house itself had no end, only layers to shed, layers to reveal, and the fire was not devouring but unveiling. The master's cries had long since gone silent, yet neighbors swore they heard them still, muffled beneath the roar, carried in the crack of beams, faint and fractured, like the echo of a throat scorched into wood. One woman wept into her shawl, swearing she heard his voice rise above the noise. "Open, open, open!" Until it broke into a howl swallowed whole. Martha stood apart, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed not on the ruin but on the smoke, as though following its path upward, her lips unmoving, though some swore they saw them shape words. And when one man asked her sharply, "Girl, what did you do?" she turned her head slow, and in the shimmer of firelight her gaze seemed hollow, so well without reflection, and he stepped back as though struck. The blaze climbed higher, licking the night itself, painting the stars red, and still it did not scatter, did not wander, as if all the wind in Georgia could not persuade it to move. It burned where it had begun, circling itself, guarding its own boundary like an animal unwilling to let prey go hours past, and still the house glowed, reduced to skeletal beams yet not falling into silence. No collapse of ash, no soft bed of embers, only flame standing upright like sentinels, burning without eating, without end. And those who remained whispered that it was not fire but judgment itself. One old man, his voice thin and trembling, whispered, "It don't want wood, it wants memory." And at that the others fell silent, for each knew the truth of what he said, that this blaze was not of their world, not the hunger of spark and kindling, but the hunger of what Martha had sealed. And when dawn broke, pale light stretching across fields, the fire did not bow to it, did not soften. It blazed against the sun itself, its color refusing to fade, its voice refusing to fall silent, and neighbors staggered home whispering that the house was gone yet not gone, burned yet not burned, consumed yet still alive. For days it burned, and those who dared approach at night swore they heard humming, the same low and steady tone that had drifted through rafters, and in the glow they swore they saw her shadow walking within. Though Martha slept in the quarters, her hands folded still, and when the sixth night came, when the fire still stood bright, the last of the timbers shuddered and bent. But as they fell they did not scatter into ash. They carved themselves into the ground like blackened bones, a frame that would not fall, a skeleton still burning, and in its heart a single door charred, sealed. The latch still glowing red, as if the nail itself had never cooled. Neighbors fled at that sight, for it was no longer a ruin but a monument, a shrine of fire that would not die. And those who passed after swore they saw figures kneeling in the blaze, their backs arched, their mouths open in silent scream, and the sound of bolts shrieking echoed in the smoke. though no doors remained, and Martha, watching from the field, lowered her head and whispered something none could hear, and though her lips moved only once, the fire seemed to flare in answer. Brighter than the dawn that tried to tame it, the fire did not end. It only waited, smouldering in silence by day, roaring by night. And the neighbors began to speak of curses, of judgment not yet satisfied, of debts unpaid, and when the seventh morning came, the ruin still burning without smoke, without ash, those who dared draw near swore they saw, above the skeleton frame of beams, a shadow walking, pacing, its shoulders hunched, its mouth wide, and the humming that rose then was not Martha's voice, but his, low, steady, broken, a song sung through flame. By morning, the ruin looked as all ruins should, blackened timber collapsed inward, stone hearth split and bleeding soot, yard littered with shards of charred glass. But those who drew near knew at once it was no ordinary end, for the air hung thick as if the fire still breathed, and in that breath lay words. The neighbors stood at the fence line, pale in the first light, their faces drawn as if the night had stripped them of years, and though none wanted to speak, one woman clutched her shawl and whispered, "Listen. Do you hear it?" The others stilled, the world itself holding breath, and from the mound rose a sound, faint at first, a sifting murmur woven in smoke that should not have remained, words half-formed, syllables dry as bone-scraping stone, carrying not the cadence of the master, nor the whisper of Martha, but something older, something that had watched long before the house was built. Some swore the voice spoke in English, fractured, stretched thin, repeating words like nails tapped into a coffin lid, locked, burned, ode, each repetition heavier than the last, as if hammering the land itself, binding it. Others swore the words were not words at all, but sounds too deep for human throats. The moan of earth beneath plough, the hiss of water swallowed by fire, the sigh of rafters long before they gave way, and though the ears could not name the tongue, the bones understood. The marrow knew it was a reckoning. One man spat into the dirt, trying to break the spell, but his spit sizzled where it landed, as if falling not on soil but on embers unseen, and he stumbled back muttering, "Not right, not right. It ain't ended." His hat clutched to his chest as though against unseen wind from the quarters. The enslaved stood apart, their eyes lowered, but their bodies swayed as if to music unheard, for they had known the sound long before the neighbors heard it, the voice that moved not through ears but through chains, through bruises, through soil damp with sweat. And to them it was not strange, only long awaited. Martha loosed it, one woman whispered to another, her lips trembling. But it ain't hers. It's older, older than us, older than them, older than the fire. And the other pressed her hand to her mouth as the ash swirled, dancing like black snow, though no wind blew. Children reached for it, tiny fingers brushing flakes that did not crumble but clung, leaving black prints that would not fade no matter how their mothers scrubbed, prints shaped not like soot but like letters, crooked symbols burned into skin, letters no one could read aloud without trembling by midday. The mound of ash shifted as if stirred from beneath, though no feet walked there, no hand touched it, and the neighbors, pale and trembling, whispered of digging, of unearthing the master's bones to bury them proper. But none stepped forward, for each time the spade was raised, the voice grew louder, syllables breaking into screams, until even the strongest man dropped his tool and fled. The land itself seemed bound, the air heavy as iron chains, the fields hushed though no wind stirred, animals refusing to graze near the ruin, birds wheeling wide circles above as if repelled, and by dusk the neighbors agreed. None would approach again until a preacher was summoned, though in their hearts they doubted holy words could unmake what smoke had made that night. The ruin glowed faint, not with flame but with a red shimmer like breath beneath skin, pulsing slow, steady, and those who dared watch swore the ash shifted in rhythm, as though the mound itself inhaled, exhaled, each sigh carrying faint words broken and cursed, shaping silence into command. Martha sat alone by the edge of the quarters, her eyes fixed on the ruin, her lips pressed tight, and one man approached her whispering, "Girl, what did you call?" But she did not answer, only raised her finger to her lips and pointed toward the ruin, where the ash seemed to lift in thin spirals, curling into the shape of hands that beckoned, hands that clawed, hands that spoke without sound. And then, just before dawn of the second day, the neighbors swore they heard it clearly for the first time, not a moan, not a hiss, but a voice deep and steady, rising from the ash like breath through a flute, speaking not to them but to the land itself. Bound, remembered, never gone. The words sank into soil, into roots, into stone, and the ground trembled faintly beneath their feet as though swallowing them whole, as though sealing them where no preacher's prayer could reach. And when the neighbors fled, refusing to turn their backs, they saw shapes rise in the drifting ash, faces half-formed, mouths moving though no breath came, eyes wide as if they had seen what no one should, each face dissolving as quickly as it formed, leaving only silence behind. But the silence was worse, for it was not empty. It was listening, and those who lived nearest swore from then on that the ground spoke when ploughed, that the fields whispered when sown, that the house was not gone but only waiting, waiting for the next name to be spoken into its ash. And Martha, turning her face from the ruin, whispered into the night, not in plea but in promise, let it remember. The first spade of earth was struck not in hope but in fear, for no man wished to dig so near the ruin. Yet the crops refused to grow and the air stank of iron, so they told themselves the soil needed turning. Though each knew the ground was already restless, it was on the third cut of the blade that the sound came, not stone, not root, but a clink hollow and deep, the cry of metal waking after too long a sleep. And when the man pulled back his spade, he saw the edge had struck a length of rusted chain. At first he thought it common iron discarded long ago, but as he bent near he felt it, not with his hand but in his chest, a pulse slow and deliberate, beating against the soil like the heart of something not yet dead. He staggered back, his breath catching, whispering, "It lives," though he dared not name what he meant, and others gathered close, staring as the chain gleamed faintly, not with rust's dull orange, but with a heat that shimmered as though it remembered fire. One man, bolder than the rest, knelt and reached for it, and the moment his fingers brushed the shackle, he cried out, clutching his hand as though burned. His skin blistered though no flame touched him, and when the others dragged him back he gasped, it beats like a chest buried beneath us." No one spoke after that, for they heard it too, faint through the soles of their boots, a pulse that travelled the earth, spreading outward, steady as tolling bells, relentless as drums of war. The oldest among them crossed himself, muttering, "Chains don't beat unless bound to flesh," and spat into the soil as though to rid his tongue of the words. Yet the spit sizzled, swallowed by dirt still warm from beneath, as though the earth itself rejected dismissal. The shackle, half unearthed, bore markings none could read, grooves deep as scars, worn into the iron not by hammer but by struggle, by years of wrists and ankles tearing against their prison, and yet it lay whole unbroken, its circle closed tighter than death, and each man knew it had not rusted into the ground but grown into it. As dusk fell, the sound grew louder, so loud the men swore their hearts stumbled to its rhythm, as if forced to follow, and one fled shrieking into the night, clutching his chest, his voice breaking, "It's inside me now, I can't," until the dark swallowed his words whole. Those who remained lit lanterns, but their light faltered, shivering as though afraid, shadows stretching long and wrong, bending not away from the flames but toward the chain, crowding it as though drawn to its heat, and in the trembling glow the iron seemed to twitch, the links stirring like snakes uncurling after sleep. Martha came at last, silent, her face unreadable, and though no one had summoned her, each man stepped aside as if they had, their bodies obeying what their mouths refused, for they knew she was already tied to what stirred beneath the soil. She knelt by the chain, her hand hovering above it, not touching, but the beat seemed to swell in answer, rising until it drowned the silence, until even the crickets hushed, until the night bent low to listen, and when her lips moved, none could hear the words, but all swore the chain quivered in reply. The men begged her to leave it buried, to cover it with earth, but she shook her head once, slow, steady, and whispered, "It was never buried, it was planted." The words hung heavy, thick as smoke, and in that moment the ground shifted, soil sinking as though exhaling, and more of the chain slithered free, curling, coiling, links glistening wet, though no rain had fallen, each loop thudding as though it carried weight not seen, and the pulse grew so strong the lantern glass quaked, rattling like teeth in a skull. The shackle at the end lay open now, its jaws wide as if waiting for a wrist, and the men swore they heard whispers rising from it, not in any tongue they knew, but in the sound of breath drawn sharp, chains rattling in empty fields, the sigh of backs bent beneath endless weight, a chorus carried by the soil itself. One man screamed then, swearing he felt hands seize his ankles, tugging him toward the open shackle. And when they dragged him back, his boots smoked. The leather scorched where it had touched earth, and he wept into his hands, babbling, "It wanted me. It wanted me in the circle." The others fled then, leaving Martha alone with the chain, though even in their flight they dared not turn their backs. And from the tree line they saw her lay her palm gently above the iron, her face calm, her lips shaping words soft and steady, and the heartbeat slowed, settling into a rhythm too deep, too vast, as though it had moved from soil into sky. The lanterns died one by one, snuffed not by wind but by something unseen, and the last thing the neighbors glimpsed before night swallowed the field was Martha's silhouette, bent over the shackle, her shadow stretching wide across the earth, stretching into shapes not her own, into figures bent and broken, kneeling, chained, their mouths open in silent scream, and as they fled into the dark, the pulse followed them, faint but unyielding, beating in their chests, beating in the soles of their feet, beating in the ground itself, until they knew the chain had not been unearthed but awakened, and in the ruin of the house where ash still smouldered, something shifted, timbers rattling though no wind stirred, and from the charred doorframe came a sound, sharp and clear, the clink of chains tightening, locking shut as if sealing itself again. The grave was dug in haste, yet every spadeful of earth seemed to resist the men who turned it, as though the ground itself recoiled from swallowing her name. They lowered the coffin at dusk, a rough box of pine with no weight inside, yet the crowd stood hushed, their eyes averted. For it was not the wood they feared, but the absence it carried. Martha had vanished into the fire's howl, or so the tale spread like soot on the wind, but still they marked her resting place, for the town would not suffer the unease of an unburied soul lingering on its borders. The preacher spoke in his hoarse voice, a tongue heavy with verses that quivered like broken strings. She was no saint, but no beast either. May her wandering be bound to this soil. May the fire close its mouth upon her shadow. And yet the women in the back row whispered, clutching shawls tight against their throats, "She is not here, she will not stay here. The earth will spit her back." The night fell quickly as if it too feared the graveyard ceremony. The air sharpened, and the lantern flames hissed like snakes, bending in a wind that never touched the living. When the last of the mourners departed, the mound seemed unsettled, not the way fresh soil naturally breathes, but with a rhythm, a slow rise and fall. As if the box beneath were filling with something not air but memory, children dared each other to creep close, to press their ears to the earth, and one swore he heard it. 3 soft knocks, not frantic, not desperate, but deliberate, as though answering a question none of them had spoken aloud by morning. Hoofprints circled the grave, though no horse was seen, and the grass lay flattened as if bodies had pressed their weight against it in prayer or in hunger. An old woman, the midwife who had once cradled Martha at her birth, stood over the mound with her crooked cane, and said in a voice both warning and confession, "They buried a name, not a girl. The soil knows the difference." The coffin remained untouched, but the mound shifted on certain nights, witnesses claimed, as though fingers clawed upward from the pine lid, pausing, waiting, testing the patience of the living. Some said the fire had not killed her, but changed her, turned her into smoke that still carried bones within it, drifting into the rafters, the trees, the very soil that now tried to contain her. One farmhand swore he saw her walking along the fence line at dawn, her dress in tatters, her eyes pale with ash, her shadow moving opposite the sun, and when he blinked she was gone, leaving only a trail of damp earth where her bare feet had pressed. The whispers grew. She cannot rest, she was bound in chains and flame. The ground rejects her, the sky rejects her, she has no place to lie, and so the grave became a threshold, neither here nor there. A door the living feared to open, but feared even more to leave unguarded. Mothers forbade their children to play near it, yet the children still crept back, drawn as moths to a candle too dark to burn, and each swore they heard the faintest sound beneath the dirt. Not weeping, not screaming, but breathing. A constable drove a stake through the mound, thinking to pin the coffin tight, but the next morning the stake had bent backward, splintered, as though forced up from below by something stronger than bone. The mound grew restless, and on the 7th night the earth cracked at its edge, spilling out black soil that steamed, though no rain had fallen. The smell sharp and sweet like burned sugar, like charred flesh. A boy, braver than wise, placed his palm on the soil and tore back with a gasp, claiming it beat against his skin like a heart too large, too furious, and he swore he heard words slip between the pulses. Not yet, not done, not gone. The grave remained sealed, yet never still, and the town began to avoid the cemetery altogether, leaving flowers at its gate rather than within, for fear the mound might rise and claim more than one name to bury. But in the dead of night, when the moon hung thin as a blade, some said they saw the earth stir, not downward but upward, as though the coffin within were not a tomb but a cradle, and something inside stretched its limbs against the walls of pine. The last who dared approach swore he saw the lid bow outward, straining against its nails, and in the silence that followed, there came a sound like a sigh pressed through centuries of soil, a sigh that did not belong to a girl or a man, but to the land itself, weary of holding what should not be held. And by dawn, though the mound still stood, though no wood had broken, the prints of small bare feet trailed away from it into the fog, leading deeper into the fields, into the places where no path had ever been cut. They say the fire ended with the house, but the house was only wood, and wood does not carry memory the way ash does. The ruins remained blackened, blistered, unrecognizable, yet neighbors swore that when the smoke thinned, a figure lingered, small and unyielding, with hands charred darker than midnight, standing in the center where the hearth once burned. Children whispered of her first, for children always see what adults refuse. A girl walks there, her dress torn, her eyes hollow, and wherever she places her feet, the ground glows red, as if embers sleep inside the earth itself. And when the men laughed, the women shushed them, for the women had already heard it, the groan of doors shutting by themselves, bolts sliding with no hand to command them. As if the locks remembered the night Martha sealed her master in flame, the land around the ruins grew restless, not burned but scorched in memory, trees twisted, their bark veined with lines like veins of coal, and no birds would roost in their branches, for wings refuse places where fire waits, on certain nights when the moon hung low and heavy. Passers-by swore they saw her wandering, the outline of a girl, blurred, trembling, trailing smoke as if her skin still smouldered, her hands curling like claws of soot. And though her face was lost in shadow, her gaze struck them cold, as if her eyes bore the weight of every locked door, every muffled scream that house had ever swallowed. One farmer, pale with dread, told how he saw her pause at his gate, her blackened fingers brushing the latch, and though he prayed aloud, "Lord, bind what should not walk," the gate swung shut with a clang that echoed through the night like judgment, and when he rushed to it, the iron was hot to the touch, though no flame had been near. The preacher gathered the town in the ruined square and whispered of demons, of spirits unclean, of vengeance bound to flesh, but his words rang thin, brittle as dead leaves, for no prayer carried weight against doors that locked themselves, and windows that shattered inward without a stone thrown. The girl's steps grew heavier, her presence surer, and soon the very earth beneath her path smoked, as though each step burned through years, reaching deeper than roots, deeper than graves, deeper than silence itself. A merchant's wife, trembling with candlelight in her eyes, confessed, "I saw her face, no longer Martha, not even a girl, but something older, wrapped in ash, her mouth moving without sound, and the earth listened, the earth obeyed." For the fire that walks does not need to consume, it remembers, it repeats, it seals. Those who crossed her path claimed their doors never opened right again, their locks stiff, their hinges groaning, as if the fire had crawled into the wood, binding it forever to silence. And in their dreams, the sound of nails hammered into latches rang again and again, until they woke choking on the taste of smoke. One man fled Savannah altogether, swearing he would rather risk starvation than another night of hearing footsteps behind his walls, when no one walked within. And before he vanished, he muttered, "She comes not for vengeance, but for remembrance, to bind all doors as hers was bound, to make the world a house that cannot be escaped." Still, some dared follow her into the ruins, drawn by terror dressed as curiosity, and those who returned spoke of a glow that pooled where her feet had pressed, small circles of red light breathing in the dirt, pulsing like wounds that never heal. One boy, bold beyond reason, touched the ground where she had stood and screamed as his palm blistered, the scar burning in the shape of a handprint far smaller than his own. The gravedigger swore he saw her wandering the cemetery gates, smoke rising in trails that bent not with the wind, but with her own breath. And when she passed, the wrought iron groaned, its hinges warping, bending, sealing the entrance shut as if the dead themselves should never be disturbed again. By then, none called her Martha, for Martha was gone into ash and fire, and what walked now was not a girl but the memory of flame given form, a curse dressed in footsteps, a silence sealed with latches, and still the whispers spread. She waits at the door, she waits at the gate, she waits where fire should never walk. And once she enters, the lock will never turn again. They say even now in the deepest hours, if you pass the ruins and see a faint red glow along the earth, do not look too long, do not follow, for the fire does not forget, and the fire does not forgive, and it walks still, searching for doors left unlatched for one night. When the air was too still and even the crickets refused their song, the town awoke to the sound of every door slamming shut in unison, bolts driving home, windows crashing closed, and in the silence that followed, they heard her humming low and steady, drifting through the rafters that no longer stood, and in the last house where the lock had not yet turned, a hand black with soot pressed against the wood, and the door shut itself with a scream like something alive.